A confident lawyer mocks a homeless man in court, assuming he knows everything about him. But when a shocking revelation ties their pasts together, his world is turned upside down. What happens when the truth comes out? Stay tuned to see how this gripping story unfolds, and share where you're watching from in the comments below. Michael Edwards adjusted his designer tie and smirked as he glanced over at the opposing table. There sat John Turner, hunched over in his ill-fitting second-hand suit, nervously fidgeting with a stack of loose papers. Michael's assistant leaned over. "That's him? The defendant?" Michael chuckled softly, his voice dripping with condescension. "Yeah, that's him. Sad, isn't it? Man looks like he walked in here straight off the streets. I could win this case in my sleep." His assistant hesitated, her voice quieter. "I think he's representing himself." Michael's grin widened. "Perfect. This'll be over by lunch." The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and Judge Evelyn Grant entered with her characteristic no-nonsense stride. She scanned the room, her sharp eyes landing briefly on Michael, her lips pressing into a thin line. Michael noticed but brushed it off. Evelyn always looked like that, perpetually disapproving. A sort of "Arise," the bailiff commanded, and the courtroom stood. Evelyn sat down at the bench, her gavel ready but unused. "Be seated," she said, her tone clipped but not unkind. "We're here to address the matter of Turner versus City Works Development." John Turner rose slowly, holding his papers like they were the only shield he had. His voice, though shaky, carried an air of determination. "Your Honor, I just want to make it clear that I'm not here to waste anyone's time. I believe I have the right to be heard." Michael stifled a laugh, earning a glare from the judge. "Mr. Edwards," she said pointedly, "do you have something you'd like to share with the court?" Michael raised his hands in mock surrender. "Not at all, Your Honor. Just admiring Mr. Turner's courage." Judge Grant's gaze lingered on him a moment longer before she turned back to John. "Go on, Mr. Turner." John shuffled through his papers, clearly nervous. "I've been homeless for the last 3 years because of what happened. I was evicted from my apartment after CityWorks illegally terminated my lease as part of their gentrification project. I lost everything: my home, my job, and my dignity. All I'm asking for is a fair review of my case." Michael leaned back in his chair, whispering to his assistant, "He should have just stayed in the shelter. This is embarrassing." The assistant frowned but didn't respond. When it was Michael's turn, he stood with a practiced flourish. He always had a commanding presence, his confidence radiating as he addressed the room. "Your Honor, with all due respect, Mr. Turner's claims are not only unfounded but border on delusional. CityWorks followed every legal protocol when it came to terminating his lease. The unfortunate reality here is that Mr. Turner has fallen on hard times, and instead of taking responsibility for his situation, he's chosen to point fingers. This isn't a legal issue, it's a personal." John flinched but stayed silent. Michael noticed, and his grin deepened. He loved this part. The moment when the other side realized they were outmatched. "I move to dismiss this case on grounds of insufficient evidence and lack of merit," Michael finished, his tone polished and triumphant. He sat down, clearly pleased with himself. The judge's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something beneath the surface. Something Michael didn't notice, but John did. She wasn't entirely on Michael's side. "Mr. Turner," Judge Grant said, "do you have any evidence or testimony to present?" John stood again, his knees visibly shaking. "Your Honor, I don't have much, but I have my story, and I believe that my story matters." Michael rolled his eyes so dramatically it earned him a quiet reprimand from the judge. "Used to work in finance," John continued. "I had a good job, a stable life. When my building was bought out, I tried to negotiate to stay. I offered to pay more in rent, but they said no. Then I lost my apartment, and without a stable address, I lost my job. It's been a downward spiral ever since." He paused, looking directly at Michael for the first time. "People like Mr. Edwards see someone like me and think we're lazy, that we're responsible for our circumstances. But the truth is, sometimes life hits harder than you can handle, and the law is supposed to protect people like me, not just the corporation." The courtroom was silent. Even Michael's assistant seemed moved, but Michael himself was unmoved. "That's a touching story," Michael said, standing again. "But what my client, this court, needs are facts, not anecdotes. Without solid evidence, I'm afraid Mr. Turner's sob story won't hold up." Judge Grant's gavel came down, silencing him. "That's enough, Mr. Edwards." Michael sat, though his smirk remained firmly in place. The judge turned to John. "Mr. Turner, I understand your circumstances, and I'll consider your statements carefully. Do you have any additional documentation to support your claims?" John hesitated, then nodded. I do. It's not much, but I have copies of the eviction notices and letters I sent to CityWorks asking to stay. I also have statements from former neighbors who witnessed what happened." He handed the papers to a court clerk, who brought them to the judge. Evelyn Grant reviewed them with a furrowed brow. "This will require further examination," she said finally. "Mr. Edwards, you'll have the opportunity to respond to this evidence at the next hearing. In the meantime, I expect professionalism from both parties." Her words were pointed, and Michael felt the sting. He adjusted his tie again, feigning nonchalance. As the courtroom emptied, John lingered near the door, organizing his papers with care. Michael strode past him, stopping just long enough to deliver one final jab. "You gave it your best shot, Turner, but you're out of your league. I'd suggest settling now before you embarrass yourself further." John didn't respond. He simply watched as Michael walked away, his confidence unshaken. But Judge Grant, who stood at a distance observing the exchange, saw something different. She saw a man desperate for justice and another blinded by arrogance. Her eyes narrowed. "Mr. Edwards?" she called out. Michael turned, startled. "Yes, Your Honor? I suggest you prepare for a longer trial than expected. This case might surprise you." Michael shrugged, flashing his winning smile. "I'm ready for whatever comes, Your Honor." Evelyn Grant said nothing, but as she turned back toward her chambers, a hint of a knowing smile played at the corners of her lips. The next court date arrived quickly. The courtroom was packed. Whispers filled the air as spectators gathered to see the continuation of a case that had unexpectedly drawn attention. On the surface, it was an ordinary lawsuit, but the sharp divide between a powerful attorney and a destitute man fighting for justice captivated the room. Michael Edwards strutted into the courtroom with his assistant trailing behind him, a stack of pristine legal files tucked under her arm. He flashed a confident smile to the judge, who responded with a neutral nod. Across the aisle, John Turner sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders slightly hunched but his eyes resolute. He was ready for the fight, no matter the odds. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Evelyn Grant entered, her sharp gaze scanning the room. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Let's proceed with Turner versus CityWorks Development. Mr. Turner, you may present your case." John rose to his feet, holding a manila folder filled with creased papers. His voice wavered slightly at first, but it grew steadier as he spoke. "Your Honor, I've spent the past few days gathering everything I could. These documents show the timeline of my eviction. You'll see that CityWorks sent notice just 2 weeks before the deadline to vacate, which is less than the required 30 days. I've also included correspondence proving I attempted to negotiate an extension. They ignored every attempt I made to pay higher rent." He handed the folder to the court clerk, who delivered it to Judge Grant. As she reviewed the materials, Michael leaned over to his assistant. "This is amateur hour," he muttered. "He's drowning, and he doesn't even realize it." His assistant didn't respond. She was watching John with an expression Michael couldn't quite place. John continued. "In addition to the letters, I have testimony from 2 former tenants who were also displaced by CityWorks. They were promised relocation assistance that never materialized." Michael stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. Testimony from tenants is irrelevant unless it directly pertains to Mr. Turner's eviction." Judge Grant raised an eyebrow. "Overruled. I'll allow it. Continue, Mr. Turner." Michael sat back down, tapping his pen against the table, irritation flashing across his face. This wasn't going as smoothly as he'd expected. The first witness, an elderly woman named Mrs. Greer, took the stand. She spoke of her own experience being evicted by CityWorks, her voice trembling with emotion. "They told me I'd get help moving," she said, "but when the time came, no one showed up. I ended up losing half my furniture because I couldn't afford to store it, and they didn't give us enough time to find a new place." Michael cross-examined her with a calculated detachment. "Mrs. Greer, while I sympathize with your situation, isn't it true that you signed a lease agreement that included a clause about potential termination?" Mrs. Greer hesitated. "Yes, but—" Michael cut her off. "So, legally speaking, CityWorks had the right to terminate your lease, correct?" She sighed. "I suppose so." "No further questions." Michael turned back to his table, his smirk returning. He knew how to bend facts to suit his narrative. As the next witness, a young single mother named Carla, began her testimony, Michael shifted uncomfortably. Carla described how she had been evicted without warning while juggling 2 jobs and raising her infant son. "I begged them for an extra week," Carla said, her voice breaking. "Just 1 week so I could find another apartment. They didn't care. They just wanted us out." Michael's cross-examination was harsher this time. "Ms. Moreno, you stated earlier that you missed multiple rent payments before the eviction notice. Isn't that correct?" Carla's face flushed. "Yes, but I explained to them why." "Answer the question," Michael interrupted, his tone sharp. "Did you miss payments or not?" "Yes," Carla admitted quietly. "No further questions." John clenched his fists as he watched Michael dismantle the testimonies, twisting them into unflattering narratives. But Judge Grant remained impassive, her expression unreadable. The real turning point came after a brief recess. Judge Grant returned to the bench and addressed the room. "Before we proceed further, I have reviewed all the documents and testimonies provided. I've also conducted some additional research of my own." Michael frowned, confused. "Research? That was unusual." "Mr. Edwards," she said, her voice steady but pointed, "you seem particularly adept at discrediting those less fortunate than yourself. Do you recall a man named Jonathan Thomas?" Michael froze. He hadn't heard that name in years. His assistant looked at him, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "I don't know what you mean, Your Honor," Michael stammered, a rare crack in his composure. Judge Grant continued, her voice growing sharper. "Perhaps you knew him by another name, John Turner." The courtroom went silent. All eyes turned to Michael, whose face drained of color. "What?" he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "Jonathan Thomas, or as he is now known, John Turner, was once a respected mentor at Randall & Co., the same law firm where you began your career. Is that correct?" Michael swallowed hard. He couldn't deny it. "Yes, Your Honor." "Would you care to tell the court why he left that position?" Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I don't see how that's relevant." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Allow me to clarify for the court. Mr. Turner sacrificed his career to protect a young associate who had been accused of misconduct. He took the fall, ensuring that the associate could continue his career unblemished. That associate was you, Mr. Edwards." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Michael's assistant stared at him, wide-eyed. "That's not—" Michael began, but Evelyn cut him off. "Enough, Mr. Edwards. I have the records to back this up. What I find truly troubling is your treatment of Mr. Turner in this courtroom. You owe your career to him, yet you've treated him with nothing but contempt." John sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the table. Michael felt the weight of the revelation settle on him like a lead blanket. He opened his mouth to speak, but found he had no words. The room remained silent as Judge Grant spoke again. "We will reconvene tomorrow to review the evidence further. But let this be a reminder to everyone in this courtroom. The law is not just about power. It is about justice, fairness, and humanity. As the gavel came down, Michael sat frozen, his mind racing. His past, long buried and forgotten, had resurfaced in the most humiliating way possible. John slowly rose, gathering his papers with a quiet dignity. He glanced briefly at Michael before leaving the courtroom, his expression unreadable. For the first time, Michael felt something unfamiliar. Shame. The assistant leaned toward him, whispering, "Is it true, what the judge said?" Michael didn't respond. He couldn't. The cracks in his carefully constructed persona were widening, and he knew there was no way to repair them. As the courtroom emptied, Evelyn Grant remained at her bench, watching Michael with a mixture of disappointment and pity. The question hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. What would Michael do now? The next morning, Michael Edwards sat at his desk in his pristine downtown office. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city, but for the first time, the sight didn't fill him with pride. Instead, it felt distant, hollow. His assistant entered, carrying a fresh cup of coffee and the stack of files he'd requested. "Your first meeting starts in 30 minutes, she said, setting the papers on his desk. Her voice was measured, as if she were unsure how to approach him after yesterday's courtroom spectacle. Michael nodded absently, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. "Cancel it," he said quietly. "Cancel?" she asked, startled. "Yes, cancel everything. I'm going to need the day to prepare for court." She hesitated but nodded. "Of course, Mr. Edwards." As she left, Michael exhaled deeply and leaned back in his chair. The judge's words from the day before echoed in his mind. You owe your career to him, yet you've treated him with nothing but contempt. Michael picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Who's it?" "David," Michael said. "It's me, Michael Edwards. I need to talk to you about John Turner." The courtroom was quieter than usual when Michael arrived later that day. The usual energy of spectators and reporters seemed dampened, as if everyone sensed something significant was about to happen. Michael's assistant sat beside him, her usual confidence replaced by unease. John Turner entered moments later, clutching his stack of papers. His second-hand suit seemed even more threadbare under the harsh courtroom lights, but his posture was straighter. There was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself now. Judge Evelyn Grant took her place at the bench, her stern gaze sweeping across the room. "We are reconvening to review the evidence and testimonies in Turner v. City Works Development," she began. Her tone was brisk, but there was an underlying gravity to her words. Before she could proceed, Michael rose to his feet. "Your Honor, may I speak before we begin?" Evelyn's sharp eyes narrowed. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Edwards." "I understand, Your Honor, but I believe it's necessary." He glanced at John, who was watching him with a wary expression. "What I have to say could impact this case." The judge considered him for a moment, then nodded. "Proceed." Michael stepped out from behind his table, his hands clasped in front of him. For once, there was no trace of his usual swagger. "Your Honor, members of the court, and most importantly, Mr. Turner," he began, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "I owe this court an apology. Yesterday, Judge Grant reminded me of something I had long buried, something I am deeply ashamed." He turned to John, his eyes meeting the older man's. "Mr. Turner, years ago, when I was a young, inexperienced associate at Randall & Co., I made a mistake that could have ended my career before it even began. You took the fall for me. You gave up everything to protect me, and in doing so, you set me on the path to becoming the lawyer I am today." The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Even Judge Grant seemed momentarily caught off guard. Michael continued, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "Yesterday, I treated you with disdain and arrogance. I dismissed your story without recognizing the man behind it, the man who taught me what it means to act with integrity. For that, I am truly sorry." John's face was unreadable, but his hands, which had been clutching his papers tightly, relaxed slightly. Michael took a deep breath. "Your Honor, I would like to offer my services to Mr. Turner pro bono for the remainder of this case. He deserves a fair chance, and I want to ensure he gets it." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. John stared at Michael, his expression a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. Judge Grant's gavel came down sharply, silencing the whispers. "Order in the court," she said, though her voice was gentler than usual. She turned to John. "Mr. Turner, do you wish to accept Mr. Edwards's offer?" John hesitated, his eyes searching Michael's face for any trace of insincerity. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, I'll accept." Michael returned to his seat, and the proceedings continued. This time, the courtroom saw a different side of him. He worked tirelessly, presenting John's evidence with precision and passion. He questioned witnesses with respect, ensuring their voices were heard. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose. By the end of the trial, the tide had shifted. Judge Grant ruled in favor of John Turner, ordering CityWorks Development to provide compensation for their unlawful eviction practices. The decision was met with a mix of relief and triumph from John, who thanked the judge and Michael with quiet sincerity. As the courtroom emptied, Michael approached John, who was gathering his papers with care. "Mr. Turner," he began, his voice hesitant, "I know I can't undo the harm I've caused, but if there's anything I can do to help you get back on your feet, please let me know." John studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that." They shook hands, a tentative but genuine gesture of reconciliation. A few weeks later, John stood outside a modest apartment building, a set of keys in his hand. It wasn't much, but it was his, a place to call home after years of living on the streets. Michael had pulled some strings to secure the apartment, and while John had been hesitant to accept the help, he ultimately recognized it as a step toward rebuilding his life. Michael visited him that afternoon, carrying a box of groceries. "Thought you might need some essentials," he said, setting the box on the kitchen counter. John smiled faintly. "Thanks. I wasn't expecting company." Michael shrugged. "Figured it was the least I could do. Besides, I owed you a housewarming." They sat at the small kitchen table, the silence between them comfortable. Michael glanced around the room, noting the sparse but tidy furnishings. "You've got a good place here. Feels like a fresh start." John nodded. "It does, and I guess I have you to thank for that." Michael shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. If anything, I'm just trying to repay a debt that can never truly be repaid." John's gaze softened. "Maybe not, but sometimes it's not about repayment. It's about doing what's right." Michael looked at him, the words sinking in. For the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. The story of the trial spread, becoming a symbol of redemption and the power of second chances. For Michael, it was a turning point, a moment that forced him to confront his flaws and find a way to be better. For John, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope and possibility. As Michael left John's apartment that evening, he paused at the door. "Take care of yourself, John." "You too, Michael," John replied. "And thank you." Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. As he walked away, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just about winning cases anymore. It was about making a difference. For both men, the journey was far from over, but for the first time, they were walking in the right direction.